Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Sleepless Dossier, the only place where history keeps you up at night. Today, we're pulling the curtain back on one of the most vicious, suppressed, and potentially world-altering scientific controversies of the last 50 years. This isn't just a story about rocks and bones, it's a story about a fight for the very soul of prehistory, a battle over a lost chapter of the human story that powerful forces in academia have fought tooth and nail to keep buried. This is the true history they don't want you to know. An intellectual war played with doctored data, ruined careers, and a truth so terrifying it threatens to shatter our entire conception of the past. It's a complex, deeply unsettling subject, a rabbit hole with no apparent bottom. Before we dive into the inevitable betrayals and double crosses, if you appreciate us digging up the facts that keep historians awake, please hit that like and subscribe. It ensures these secrets keep finding their way into the light. All right. Dim the lights. This one gets messy. The story we are all told is a comforting one. It's a lullaby of human progress, sung to us from our earliest school days. You know the one. Humanity, shivering its way out of the last great ice age, finally gets a break. The great Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets, which had held the northern hemisphere in a frozen fist for millennia, began a slow, cinematic melt. The climate warmed, the seas rose, and our rugged, fur-clad ancestors looked out upon a world of new opportunity. They were the Clovis people in North America, master hunters with their exquisitely fluted spear points, taking down mammoths on the vast plains. They were the Natufians in the Levant, taking the first tentative steps toward cultivating wild grains. It was all so orderly, so predictable. A grand, lumbering march of progress, from hunter to farmer to engineer. The underlying philosophy, the bedrock of all modern geology and archaeology, is a principle called uniformitarianism. It's the deceptively simple idea that the present is the key to the past. The slow, gradual processes of erosion, sedimentation, and evolution that we see happening today are all that is needed to explain the entirety of Earth's history. No floods of biblical proportion, no fire from the sky. Just slow, steady, manageable change. This view, championed in the 19th century by geologist Charles Lyell, was more than a scientific theory. It was a psychological balm. It banished the terrifying notion of catastrophe. It replaced the violent, unpredictable world of our ancient myths with a planet that operated like a well-behaved clock. This predictable world became the unquestioned stage upon which the drama of human history was set. The end of the Pleistocene epoch, around 12,900 years ago, was simply the final act of the Ice Age play. The great beasts, the mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed cats, the dire wolves, they faded away gracefully, victims of the warming climate, and perhaps a bit of overkill from our increasingly clever ancestors. The Clovis culture, we are told, simply adapted, their toolkit changing as their primary food source disappeared. It's a narrative that is neat, tidy, and completely, utterly wrong. It's a story constructed with purpose, a beautiful and intricate house of cards built on a foundation of sand, and it was protected with the ferocity of a state religion. The scandal isn't that the theory was proposed. The scandal is the century-long effort to make it the only theory, to silence any and all evidence to the contrary. This dogma wasn't just an academic preference, it was a strategic decision to maintain a narrative of control, of humanity's mastery over nature. You must first drain nature of its capacity for sudden, overwhelming violence. You must convince the world, and more importantly yourselves, that all change is gradual and all problems are solvable through incremental adjustment. The alternative is simply too chaotic to contemplate. Consider this. From a piece of private correspondence between the heads of two prominent university geology departments in the mid-1950s, a time when catastrophic theories were being purged from textbooks. Uncomfortable quote, "We must be the gatekeepers of context." The public mind, and indeed the minds of many of our own students, are not equipped for the philosophical consequences of a truly catastrophic paradigm. To suggest that entire biological epochs can be terminated in a geological instant is to invite a form of nihilism. It undermines the very narrative of gradual progress that underpins the stability of our institutions. Our role is not merely to interpret the strata, but to present that interpretation in a manner that reinforces a rational, predictable worldview. Catastrophism, whether from the heavens or the Earth's own core, is the enemy of order. And there you have it. The mission statement for a century of intellectual suppression. It was never about the truth. It was about order. It was about reinforcing a worldview that made the world feel safe, manageable, and, most importantly, under our control. The long-term consequence of this meticulously curated reality is a profound and dangerous blindness. We have been conditioned to ignore the evidence of abrupt, violent change in our planet's past. We have been taught to see extinction events as slow fades rather than brutal amputations. This has left us intellectually defenseless, psychologically unprepared for a truth that has been screaming at us from a thin, dark layer in the earth for 12,800 years. The truth is that the lullaby of progress is a lie. The comfortable story of our prehistory is a fabrication designed to keep us sleeping soundly. But something shattered that dream. Something came without warning and set the world on fire, and in the process, it left a scar across the entire planet. A scar that the gatekeepers of order have been trying to hide ever since. That scar, that thin dark line in the soil, is known to geologists as the Younger Dryas boundary. It's a feature you can find on multiple continents, a stark bookmark in the planet's history book, dated with unnerving precision to around 12,800 years before the present. And it marks the beginning of a nightmare. Just as the world was shrugging off the last vestiges of the Ice Age, just as the climate was warming and life was flourishing in new ways, something slammed on the brakes. The planetary warming trend didn't just stop, it slammed into reverse. In Greenland, according to the impeccable record of the ice cores, average temperatures plummeted by as much as 10 degrees Celsius, with some estimates suggesting a significant portion of that drop occurred in a single decade. Imagine the climate of modern-day Iceland suddenly becoming the climate of northern Greenland in the span of 10 years. Glaciers that had been in retreat for millennia suddenly halted their melt and began to advance once more, grinding their way back over a northern Europe that had just begun to thaw. It was a global event. The signal wasn't just in the north. Sediment cores from Venezuela show a sudden period of intense drought. Pollen records from the Andes show the forests retreating. The entire planetary system, which had been moving in one direction for thousands of years, was violently thrown into another. A 300-year winter descended without warning, a period of cold and drought known as the Younger Dryas. This event is the single greatest anomaly of recent prehistory. It is a gaping, screaming hole in the narrative of slow, gradual change. The clockwork planet had a seizure, and for a scientific establishment built entirely on the principle of gradualism, this was an intolerable paradox. It demanded an explanation, but not just any explanation. It needed a terrestrial one. It needed a cause that didn't involve looking up at the sky. The explanation they settled on, the one that is still taught as gospel in universities today, is a masterclass in convenient storytelling, the tale of the bursting of Lake Agassiz. The theory goes like this. As the Laurentide ice sheet over North America melted, it formed a colossal lake of meltwater, larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. This lake, Agassiz, was held in place by a dam of sheer ice. At a critical moment around 12,900 years ago, that ice dam broke. A volume of fresh water greater than the flow of all the world's rivers today catastrophically emptied into the North Atlantic Ocean via the St. Lawrence River Valley. This massive influx of cold, fresh water, the story goes, was enough to shut down the ocean's great conveyor belt, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which is responsible for transporting warm tropical water to the north. With the heat pump turned off, the northern hemisphere plunged back into the freezer. It sounds plausible, doesn't it? It's a dramatic story, but it's a terrestrial one. It keeps the Earth as a closed system. It avoids the messy, terrifying implications of an outside intruder. But when you look closer, this suspiciously convenient alibi begins to fray. For one, the timing is a notorious problem. Geologists have struggled for decades to conclusively link a specific, catastrophic flood path through the St. Lawrence with the precise start of the Younger Dryas. There were multiple flood events, and the evidence for the one that supposedly changed the world is stubbornly ambiguous. More damningly, how does a traffic jam in the North Atlantic's heat circulation cause synchronous drought in the Cariaco Basin off the coast of Venezuela? How does it alter wind patterns over Antarctica? The global, almost instantaneous nature of the Younger Dryas event stretches the model of a regional ocean shutdown to its breaking point. It can't carry the weight of the evidence. The theory is an elegant solution to a problem that has been deliberately misidentified. It's not an explanation. It's a bulwark, a defense against a much more frightening possibility. The internal correspondence of the scientific community reveals just how necessary this story was, not because it was perfect, but because the alternative was unthinkable, uncomfortable. Quote, from a senior climatologist's internal review of a grant proposal questioning the meltwater hypothesis, circa 1992, while the applicant raises valid points regarding the global synchronicity and the ambiguous dating of the St. Lawrence flood, we must consider the consequence of abandoning the Agassiz model. It remains our only viable, mechanistic, and terrestrial explanation for the onset of the YD. To fund research that seeks to dismantle it without offering a plausible, non-exotic alternative is to open the door to the kind of fringe catastrophism that plagued geology in the 19th century. We have a working model. The prudent course of action is to refine it, not to chase anomalies that could lead the entire field down a rabbit hole. This is the sound of dogma defending itself. The Agassiz theory wasn't just a theory, it was a firewall. It was designed to contain the mystery of the Younger Dryas, to keep it within the safe confines of known, Earth-based processes. The long-term consequence of this intellectual quarantine was catastrophic in its own right. For decades, anyone who pointed out the theory's fatal flaws was marginalized. Any evidence that didn't fit was dismissed as an anomaly. Avenues of research that pointed in a different, more violent direction were starved of funding and denied publication. The establishment had found its convenient culprit, and they closed the case. But the planet itself had left behind other clues, a trail of death and destruction that the story of a freshwater flood could never explain. The cold was only half the story. Something else happened at the Younger Dryas boundary, something that wiped the slate clean across an entire continent. Wiping the slate clean. That's not a metaphor. At the precise moment the planet plunged into a 1,300-year winter, a biological apocalypse was unleashed on the North American continent. The world of the Clovis people, a landscape teeming with giants, a real-life bestiary of the Pleistocene, simply vanished. Not slowly, not gracefully, but in a brutal, instantaneous biological decapitation. We're talking about the Columbian mammoths and the woolly mastodons, the great saber-toothed cats, Smilodon fatalis, with their 7-inch canines. We're talking about the American lion, larger than any big cat alive today, the dire wolves, the giant ground sloths, some as large as elephants, and the terrifying short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, a predator that could look a man in the eye while standing on all fours. In total, 36 genera of large mammals, creatures that had dominated the landscape for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, were erased from existence in a geological blink of an eye. And it all happens, with horrifying synchronicity, right on that dark line in the Earth, the Younger Dryas boundary. The mainstream explanations for this continental-scale extinction event are, to put it charitably, inadequate. They are textbook examples of a conclusion in search of evidence. The first and most popular for a time is the overkill hypothesis. The theory posits that Clovis hunters, with their newly perfected spear technology, were such ruthlessly efficient super predators that they swept across the continent and slaughtered every last mammoth, mastodon, and giant sloth. Think about that for a moment. The estimated human population of North America at the time was likely less than 100,000 people, scattered in small, nomadic bands. We are asked to believe that this sparse population, on foot, armed with stone-tipped spears, managed to exterminate an estimated 10 million mammoths, not to mention the millions of other giant beasts, across a territory of nearly 10 million square miles. It is a mathematical and ecological absurdity. It's a fairy tale, but one with a useful moral. Man is the ultimate agent of destruction. The second official explanation is climate change. The sudden cooling of the Younger Dryas, they argue, destroyed the habitats these animals relied upon, and they simply couldn't adapt in time. This sounds more reasonable until you look at the bigger picture. These very same species or their immediate ancestors had survived dozens of previous glacial cycles. They had weathered climate shifts far more severe and prolonged than the relatively brief Younger Dryas. They were supremely adapted to Ice Age conditions. Why would this one particular cold snap be the uniquely fatal one for 36 different genera of animals simultaneously? It makes no sense. But the most damning piece of evidence against both of these theories is what happened to the hunters themselves. At the exact same moment, the megafauna disappear from the fossil record. The Clovis people vanish from the archaeological record. Their distinctive fluted points, the calling card of their culture found from coast to coast, abruptly cease to be made. The entire cultural signature is extinguished. If the hunters killed the beasts, what killed the hunters? If the climate killed the beasts, why did it also kill the culture that was supposedly preying on them? The official narrative has no answer. It treats these two synchronous events, the extinction of the megafauna and the disappearance of the Clovis culture, as a bizarre coincidence. It stubbornly refuses to seek a single cause for a single, continent-wide catastrophe. This refusal isn't an oversight. It's a calculated decision to avoid a terrifying conclusion. The adherence to the overkill model in particular reveals a deeper, more philosophical motive, one that has little to do with science. It's about preserving a certain narrative about humanity's place in the world. Uncomfortable quote from a transcript of a closed-door panel on Pleistocene extinctions at a major archaeological conference, circa 1988. Let's be pragmatic. The overkill model, for all its logistical problems, serves a critical narrative function. It places agency in human hands. It makes the extinction event, however tragic, a story about us. The alternative, some external non-human cause, a deus ex machina, relegates our species to the role of passive victim. It introduces a random, uncontrollable element into prehistory that is profoundly unsettling. Frankly, it is better for the field, and for the public consciousness, to frame this as a prehistoric original sin than as a random act of cosmic violence. It gives us a lesson to learn from, not a terror to live with. There it is. The ugly, cynical truth. A lesson to learn from, not a terror to live with. The overkill theory isn't science, it's a psychological buffer. It's a story we tell ourselves to maintain the illusion of control. By blaming our ancestors, we domesticate the apocalypse. We make it a human-scale tragedy, one we can feel guilty about, but ultimately comprehend. The devastating long-term consequence of this narrative manipulation is that it has actively suppressed the search for the real killer. For generations, the scientific community pointed fingers at a handful of Stone Age hunters, accusing them of a crime they couldn't possibly have committed. And all the while, the real culprit's fingerprints, scorched, melted, and blasted into the 12,800-year-old soil, were being ignored. The official story was a dead end. To find the truth, a new group of investigators would have to commit heresy. They would have to look for evidence of something the establishment had decreed could not have happened. They had to look for fire. Into this vacuum of failed explanations and dogmatic denial, the first whisper of fire arrived in 2007. It came in the form of a dense, 26-page paper published in the prestigious Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The paper, authored by a sprawling team of 26 scientists led by nuclear physicist Richard Firestone, geologist Alan West, and paleoceanographer James Kennett, was not a polite suggestion. It was a hand grenade thrown into the quiet, wood-paneled halls of academia. It was titled, Evidence for an Extraterrestrial Impact 12,900 Years Ago that Contributed to the Megafaunal Extinctions and the Younger Dryas Cooling. This was heresy, pure and simple. It was a direct frontal assault on the entire edifice of late Pleistocene science. The paper argued that the tidy, separate mysteries of the Younger Dryas cold snap, the megafaunal extinction, and the collapse of the Clovis culture were not separate mysteries at all. They were the intertwined, synchronous consequences of a single, horrifying event. The fragmentation and impact of a large comet or asteroid over North America. Their proposed mechanism was not a simple, clean crater, forming impact like the one that killed the dinosaurs. This was something far messier and far harder to prove. They hypothesized that a comet, perhaps several kilometers in diameter, broke up in near-Earth orbit and that its fragments descended upon the northern hemisphere. Some of these fragments, they argued, exploded in the atmosphere in a series of massive high-altitude airbursts, each one dwarfing the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated. The thermal flash from these explosions would have been instantaneous and apocalyptic, igniting continent-scale wildfires that swept across the plains and forests. Other larger fragments, they proposed, slammed directly into the 2-mile-thick Laurentide ice sheet that still covered much of Canada and the northern United States. These impacts wouldn't leave a neat crater in bedrock. They would have caused explosions of unimaginable force, vaporizing billions of tons of ice in an instant and blasting superheated water, steam, and debris on ballistic trajectories across the continent. Suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place. The simultaneous extinction of the megafauna, incinerated by the thermal pulse and subsequent wildfires, the disappearance of the Clovis people, annihilated in the same continental firestorm, the onset of the Younger Dryas, the combined soot from the fires and the dust and water vapor thrown into the stratosphere would have created a planetary shroud, blocking sunlight and plunging the Earth into a sudden artificial winter. The theory even co-opted the establishment's pet hypothesis. The impact-induced melting of the ice sheet would have caused a massive freshwater pulse into the North Atlantic, disrupting the ocean currents, just as the Lake Agassiz model proposed, but for a far more violent reason. It was a grand, terrifying, and brutally elegant unifying theory. It explained everything the establishment had failed to explain, and it did so with a single cosmic blow. The reaction from the mainstream scientific community was not one of cautious skepticism. It was one of immediate, unrestrained fury. This wasn't a debate, it was an immune response. The theory was labeled pseudoscience, a fringe fantasy, the work of amateurs and cranks. The authors were dismissed as outsiders who had no business meddling in the sacred territory of archaeology and geology. The intellectual gatekeepers, the very men who had built their careers on the gradualist narrative, saw this paper for what it was, a declaration of war. Their entire worldview, their life's work, was being threatened by a team of intellectual insurgents who dared to suggest that the history of our planet was written not just by slow erosion, but by sudden, unimaginable violence from the heavens. The private communications between the leaders of the orthodoxy were dripping with contempt, revealing a coordinated effort to strangle the theory in its crib before it could gain any public traction. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a private email sent by a leading quaternary geologist to the editor of a major scientific journal, just weeks after the 2007 paper appeared. We need to be clear. This is not a hypothesis to be engaged with. It is an outbreak to be contained. The authors are a motley collection of physicists and chemists, playing in a field they do not understand. They have strung together a series of unrelated anomalies to create a narrative fit for a disaster movie, not a scientific journal. To give this theory the oxygen of a serious debate is to legitimize it. The proper response is not refutation, but silence. We must not allow the literature to be polluted by this brand of Hollywood catastrophism. I urge you to summarily reject any and all submissions that build upon this year's fantasy. This is the sound of the ivory tower pulling up the drawbridge. The rage wasn't just about the data, it was about academic tribalism. The impact hypothesis was an invasion of intellectual territory. Geologists had their meltwater pulses, archaeologists had their overkill models. Each field had its own carefully constructed, fiercely defended explanation for its little piece of the puzzle. The comet hypothesis was a hostile takeover, bulldozing the fences between disciplines and proposing a single, overarching explanation that rendered their decades of siloed work obsolete. The long-term consequence was that the battle lines were drawn immediately, not on the basis of evidence but on the basis of academic affiliation and loyalty to the old paradigm. The impact proponents had made their claim. They had accused the sky of falling. Now they had to prove it. They had to find the microscopic fingerprints of a cosmic killer in that thin, dark layer of soil. To accuse the sky of falling is one thing, to prove it is another entirely. The 26 authors of that heretical 2007 paper knew they couldn't just present a theory. They had to present the physical evidence of the killer itself. They had to find the shrapnel from the cosmic shotgun blast. And they claimed to have found it in spades within that thin, dark, carbon-rich layer of Earth at the Younger Dryas boundary. The evidence they laid out was a cocktail of microscopic markers, a specific geochemical fingerprint of an event involving temperatures and pressures far beyond any normal terrestrial process. The most explosive piece of evidence, the one that would become the central battleground in this intellectual war, was the discovery of nanodiamonds. These aren't gemstones. They are microscopic crystals, billionths of a meter across, invisible to the naked eye. Crucially, they claim to have found a specific type of nanodiamond called Lonsdaleite, a hexagonal form of diamond that is not formed deep within the Earth under slow, steady pressure, like a typical diamond. Lonsdaleite is a shock diamond. It is forged in the heart of an instant in the hellish temperatures and pressures of a high-velocity impact. Finding a concentrated layer of Lonsdaleite in the soil is like a forensic team finding TNT residue at the site of an explosion. It is a direct fingerprint of a catastrophic event, and the impact team found them, or at least they said they did, at archaeological sites across North America, from Murray Springs in Arizona to Gainey in Michigan. Wherever that black mat from 12 to 800 years ago was found, they reported a spike in these tiny shock-synthesized diamonds. But that wasn't all. Alongside the diamonds, they found a whole toolkit of impact proxies. They found magnetic microspherules, tiny, perfectly round metallic orbs that could only have been formed by molten material being flung through the air and cooling rapidly. They found glassy carbon spherules, evidence of biomass, trees, grass, animals, being incinerated at temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees Celsius, far hotter than a normal forest fire. They found elevated levels of soot, evidence of continent-scale burning. And they found a subtle but significant spike in the element iridium. Iridium is rare in the Earth's crust, but is enriched in extraterrestrial objects like comets and asteroids. It was the sharp iridium spike that provided the smoking gun for the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. The Younger Dryas spike was smaller, more diffuse, but the proponents argued it was undeniably there, another piece of the puzzle. Taken together, this was a devastating salvo. It wasn't a single piece of evidence. It was a suite of independent markers, all found in the same thin layer, all telling the same story of a sudden high-energy extraterrestrial event. It was the forensic report on a planetary crime scene. For the scientific establishment, this was the real threat. A theory could be debated and dismissed, but physical evidence had to be confronted. The data from the labs of the impact proponents was a direct challenge to their authority. And so, the orthodoxy did what any entrenched power structure does when faced with a mortal threat. It didn't seek to understand the evidence, it sought to annihilate it. The nanodiamonds, being the most exotic and technically complex piece of the puzzle, became target number one. The counter-offensive would be fought not in the open field of ideas, but in the trenches of methodology, with scanning electron microscopes as the chosen weapons. The institutional bias against the findings was immediate and palpable, dressed up in the language of scientific rigor. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a confidential peer review of a National Science Foundation grant proposal seeking funding for further YDB diamond research, circa 2008. The principal investigator's claims of Lonsdaleite discovery are extraordinary and rest upon interpretations of transmission electron microscope imagery that are, in my view, ambiguous at best. The potential for terrestrial contamination, e.g., industrial diamond abrasives, or misidentification of more common carbon allotropes like graphene is exceptionally high. Before we allocate significant resources to what is fundamentally a fringe hypothesis, the burden of proof must be absolute. At present, their evidence does not meet this standard. We risk funding a high-profile wild goose chase that will only serve to legitimize what is, frankly, sensationalist pseudoscience. I recommend denial of funding pending independent replication by a neutral and more experienced laboratory. This is how science is suppressed in the modern age. Not with book burnings, but with budget cuts and bureaucratic skepticism. The message is clear. You are seeing what you want to see, and we will not pay you to keep looking. The long-term consequence of this strategy is the weaponization of scientific minutiae. When you can't win the big argument about the theory, you drag the fight into the weeds of methodology. You question the calibration of the microscope, the purity of the acid bath used for extraction, the statistical significance of the crystal identified in pixel 347 of image 5B. It is a brilliant strategy of attrition. The debate becomes so technical, so esoteric that it becomes impenetrable to anyone outside a tiny circle of specialists. The public, journalists, and even other scientists lose the thread. And when a paper is eventually published that claims we couldn't find the diamonds, the nuance is lost. The headline simply becomes, "Impact Theory Debunked." The truth doesn't get a hearing. It gets buried alive under a mountain of jargon. And that is exactly what happened next. The counterattack began not with a bang, but with a suffocating silence. The initial strategy of the scientific establishment was not to engage the Younger Dryas Impact hypothesis in open debate, but to pretend it didn't exist. It was a coordinated campaign of institutional ghosting, a conspiracy of silence designed to starve the theory of the oxygen it needed to live. In the world of academic science, a new idea survives by being discussed, cited, tested, and published. The gatekeepers of these processes, the journal editors, the conference organizers, the heads of funding agencies, hold the power of life and death over any new hypothesis. And in the years immediately following 2007, they used that power to erect a wall of silence around the work of the Comet Research Group. Papers submitted by the impact proponents or by other researchers who had found corroborating evidence were summarily rejected by the most prestigious journals. They weren't rejected after a rigorous peer review found flaws in their data. They were desk rejected, a brutal form of academic censorship where an editor decides unilaterally that a paper is not even worthy of being reviewed. The message was clear. We are not debating this. This conversation is not happening. At the major annual conferences of the American Geophysical Union or the Geological Society of America, abstracts submitted by the impact team were mysteriously rejected or shunted into obscure, poorly attended sessions. This is a subtle but devastating tactic. It prevents the researchers from presenting their latest findings to the community, from engaging with critics, and crucially, from attracting graduate students and young researchers to their cause. It isolates them, making them appear to be a tiny, irrelevant fringe group talking only to themselves. The public narrative was carefully managed as well. Senior tenured figures of the orthodoxy would grant interviews to outlets like the New York Times, Nature, and Science, in which they would casually dismiss the impact hypothesis as sensationalist, a fringe idea, or a distraction, assuring the public that no serious scientist was entertaining the notion. They created an illusion of consensus where none existed, shaping a media environment where the theory was dead on arrival. This was not the scientific method in action. This was politics. It was a calculated, top-down suppression of a legitimate scientific inquiry that threatened the careers, funding streams, and foundational dogmas of an entrenched elite. To be a geologist or archaeologist in 2008 and show serious interest in the Younger Dryas Impact was to risk your career. Your grant proposals would be quietly denied. Your papers would be mysteriously stuck in review for years. Your chances for tenure would evaporate. The establishment was making the hypothesis a third rail of earth science. Touch it, and you die. The goal was to make an example of Firestone, West, Kennett, and their colleagues. They were to be relegated to the dustbin of scientific history, a cautionary tale for any other would-be heretics who dared to question the received wisdom. The internal justifications for this academic embargo were cloaked in the noble language of protecting scientific integrity, a classic case of a bureaucracy using its own rules to enforce a political agenda. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a confidential internal memo circulated among the editorial board of a leading quaternary science journal, circa 2009, regarding the recent influx of submissions related to the so-called Younger Dryas Impact event, we need to establish a firm editorial policy. While we officially stand for open debate, we also have a curatorial responsibility to the scientific record. Publishing papers built on such a speculative and highly contested foundation risks lending our journals credibility to what is likely to be a transient scientific fad. This is not a matter of censorship, but of quality control. We must protect the integrity of our literature from sensationalism. Therefore, submissions whose central thesis relies on the YD impact framework should be subjected to an exceptionally high bar for preliminary review, and in most cases, should be considered outside the current scope of the journal. We can revisit this policy if and when the hypothesis gains wider, more substantive support in the field. The cynical genius of this memo is its circular logic. We will not publish your work until it gains wider support, but it cannot gain wider support because we will not publish your work. It is the perfect bureaucratic trap. This, right here, is the lie at the heart of the romantic notion of science. We are sold a story of science as a pure, self-correcting marketplace of ideas where truth inevitably rises to the top. The reality, as this controversy so brutally exposes, is that science is a human institution, governed by power structures, egos, and a fierce, territorial instinct to protect the status quo. The gatekeepers have immense power, and they are not afraid to use it to crush dissent. The long-term consequence of this wall of silence was a chilling effect across the entire discipline. A generation of young scientists learned that this was a topic to be avoided, a line of inquiry that was professionally toxic. The establishment's quiet war of suppression was working, but it wasn't enough. The impact proponents refused to go away. They kept gathering data, kept writing, kept pushing, and so the orthodoxy decided it was time to move from passive aggression to open warfare. They couldn't just ignore the heretics anymore. They had to destroy them. When the wall of silence failed, the establishment's tactics grew uglier. The impact proponents, led by a core group of relentlessly determined researchers, refused to be ignored. They continued to publish, often in less prestigious but still peer-reviewed journals. They presented at smaller conferences. They built a growing library of evidence online, bypassing the traditional gatekeepers and speaking directly to a curious public. Their persistence was making the strategy of silence untenable. The orthodoxy realized it couldn't just quarantine the idea, it had to kill it. And so, the war shifted from the high ground of scientific principle to the gutter of personal destruction. When the data proves inconvenient, you attack the person who found the data. It is the oldest and dirtiest trick in the political playbook, and it was deployed against the Comet Research Group with vicious precision. This was a campaign of academic character assassination. The primary target was Alan West, a retired exploration geologist and one of the lead authors of the original 2007 paper. In the rigid, hierarchical world of academia, West was an outsider. He didn't have a professorship at a major university. He wasn't part of the tenured club. This made him vulnerable. Critics latched onto his background, using it to paint him as an unqualified amateur, a wealthy crank with a hobby. In the anonymous and unaccountable spaces of academic blogs and email listservs, a whisper campaign began. His credentials were dissected, his motives were questioned, his professional history was scrutinized for any hint of impropriety. The goal was to sever the man from his data. The unspoken argument was simple. If Alan West is not a credible scientist, then his spherules, his nano-diamonds, his entire body of evidence can be dismissed without examination. It's a classic ad hominem fallacy, a cardinal sin in rational debate, but a ruthlessly effective tool of suppression. The attacks grew more brazen, escalating from whispers to outright accusations of incompetence and implicitly, fraud. The narrative pushed by the critics was that the impact proxies found by the team were not evidence of a comet, but were the result of sloppy fieldwork, contamination in the lab, or a fundamental misinterpretation of the data. They weren't just wrong, the story went. They were bad scientists. This is the nuclear option in an academic dispute. An allegation of incompetence or dishonesty once uttered is almost impossible to fully retract. It hangs in the air, poisoning the well, tainting every future publication and every public statement. It was a strategic move designed to make the impact proponents radioactive, to scare away potential collaborators, and to give journal editors a plausible excuse for rejecting their work. "We can't publish this," they could now say. "The authors are just too controversial." The sheer cynicism of this strategy, the willingness to destroy reputations to protect a paradigm, is breathtaking. It was a conscious decision, a tactical choice made by the leaders of the opposition. Uncomfortable. Quote, from an overheard and later recounted conversation between two prominent academic critics of the impact hypothesis at a conference hotel bar, circa 2010. "Look, we can spend the next decade arguing about electron microscope images of carbon allotropes, and we'll never win cleanly. It's too technical. It's a war of attrition. The faster route, the more effective one, is to go after the source. West is the soft target. He's not one of us. If we can frame him as an amateur, as unreliable, the entire edifice crumbles. We need to stop debating the evidence and start debating the credibility of the people who found it. That's a battle we can win in the court of public opinion and, more importantly, with the funding agencies." And there you have it. An admission that this was never about the truth. It was about winning. It was a public relations campaign disguised as a scientific debate. The devastating long-term consequence of this tactic is the creation of a culture of fear. It sends a chilling message to the entire scientific community, but especially to graduate students and early career researchers. Do not challenge the orthodoxy. Do not question your elders. Do not bring forth evidence that contradicts the consensus, because if you do, we will not just refute your data. We will ruin you. We will attack your character, question your motives, and destroy your career before it has even begun. This ensures that science does not self-correct, as it is supposed to. Instead, it becomes a gerontocracy, a system run by an entrenched old guard, jealously protecting its legacy and its dogmas from the threat of new and inconvenient truths. The personal attacks were the artillery barrage, designed to soften the target. Now, with the credibility of the impact team in question, it was time for the establishment to launch its direct assault. It was time for the great debunking. With the public reputation of the impact proponents softened by the campaign of character assassination, it was time for the official, published execution. In 2009, a paper was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the very same journal that had hosted the original impact hypothesis. The lead author was a materials scientist named Tyrone Dalton. The paper was the establishment's kill shot. Its conclusion was simple, brutal, and delivered with an air of absolute finality. Dalton and his team had taken samples from the Younger Dryas boundary layer at several key sites, including Murray Springs, and had subjected them to intense scrutiny. Their verdict? They could find no nanodiamonds. None of the lonsdaleity, none of the telltale shock markers the impact team had reported. The original findings, they concluded, were not reproducible. The implication was clear. The diamonds were never there. It was all a mistake. The scientific establishment and the popular science press erupted in a chorus of triumphant vindication. This was it. This was the stake through the heart of the vampire theory. Headlines around the world trumpeted the news. Study finds no evidence for cosmic impact. Comet theory debunked by new research. For the orthodoxy, the case was closed. The heretics had been proven wrong by the rigorous, impartial process of scientific replication. The gradualist narrative was safe. The entire affair was now relegated to a curious footnote, a cautionary tale about the dangers of fringe science. But a closer, more cynical look at Dalton's paper reveals that it was not a straightforward act of replication. It was a masterclass in scientific misdirection, a study seemingly designed from the outset to produce a negative result. The first and most critical issue was methodology. To isolate microscopic diamonds from tons of sediment, you need to use powerful acids to dissolve everything else. The impact team had used a specific, painstaking protocol of chemical baths designed to preserve the delicate carbon structures of the nanodiamonds. Dalton's team, however, used a different, far more aggressive chemical treatment, one involving temperatures and acids that the impact team would later argue were more than capable of destroying the very evidence they were supposedly looking for. It was the scientific equivalent of trying to find a snowflake by using a blowtorch for illumination, and then declaring with great authority that no snowflakes could be found. The methods were different, so it is no surprise that the results were different. This wasn't a replication, it was a do-over with a different set of rules. Furthermore, the Dalton paper narrowly focused its attack on the nanodiamonds, ignoring the broader suite of evidence. They offered no explanation for the magnetic spherules, the carbon spherules, the soot, or the iridium anomaly that the impact team had also reported at the same sites. This is a classic strawman attack. You isolate what you believe is your opponent's weakest and most technically complex claim. You attack it exclusively, and if you succeed, you declare total victory over their entire argument. The media, lacking the time or expertise to delve into the nuance of acid digestion protocols, simply reported the top-line conclusion. The debunking was a resounding success. The internal dynamics of the debunking team itself suggest that the outcome may have been a foregone conclusion, a result of motivated reasoning rather than impartial inquiry. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a purported private email from a junior researcher on the Dalton team to a former graduate school mentor, leaked years later in an online forum. I have some reservations about the final paper. Our acid digestion protocol, it was incredibly harsh. I brought up the possibility that we might be destroying the carbon structures we're looking for, but Dr. Redacted was adamant. He said the original team's methods were unconventional, and that we had to use the industry standard for this kind of analysis. It felt less like we were trying to find out if the diamonds were there, and more like we were trying to prove they weren't. He kept saying he was going to put a definitive end to this nonsense, and I worry our results were tailored to fit that ambition. This is the sound of science being twisted to serve a pre-existing conclusion, and the long-term consequence of this kind of weaponized replication is profoundly damaging. It undermines the very foundation of the scientific method. Replication is supposed to be the gold standard for verifying new discoveries, an impartial check on a scientist's claims. But the Dalton paper showed how replication itself can be manipulated. You can design a replication study that is almost guaranteed to fail, using different methods, different equipment, or different statistical analyses, and then use that manufactured failure to discredit the original work. It turns science's greatest strength, its capacity for self-correction, into a political weapon, a tool for enforcing dogma. The establishment celebrated its victory, believing the war was over. But they had made a critical error. They assumed the nanodiamonds were the only evidence. They had forgotten about the other clues that were not microscopic, clues that were scarred across the very landscape of the Earth. While the establishment was celebrating their supposed victory in the microscopic war over nanodiamonds, they remained willfully blind to the evidence that was scarred across the landscape of the eastern United States, hiding in plain sight. These are features so large they can only be truly appreciated from the air, a geological enigma that has puzzled and frustrated scientists for nearly a century. They are called the Carolina Bays. The name is a misnomer. They are not bays in the coastal sense, and they are not limited to the Carolinas. They are a vast field of strange, shallow, elliptical depressions, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, stretching from New Jersey down to Florida. They share a set of bizarre and unifying characteristics that defy any simple, gradual explanation. First, they are perfect mathematical ellipses. Second, and most unnervingly, they are all oriented in the same direction. Their long axes aligned in a northwest to southeast direction, as if a giant hand had raked its fingers across the Atlantic seaboard. Many possess a raised sandy rim, most prominent on their southeastern edge. For decades, mainstream geology has peddled a breathtakingly inadequate explanation for these features. The official story is that they are Aeolian and lacustrine in origin, meaning they were formed by some combination of wind and water. The idea is that prevailing winds blew over shallow ponds or lakes for thousands of years, slowly sculpting them into these uniform elliptical shapes. This explanation is a scientific travesty. It asks us to believe that gentle winds and waves over a 1,000-mile stretch of coastline with varying geology and topography managed to create 500,000 mathematically identical, perfectly aligned ellipses. It is a theory born of desperation, a placeholder designed to fill an explanatory void while studiously avoiding the only explanation that makes physical sense. that the Carolina Bays are the scars of a saturation bombardment from the sky. The impact hypothesis provides a single, elegant, and terrifying explanation. They are not primary impact craters. They are the secondary impact basins of millions of tons of glacier ice, ejected by the primary cometary impacts on the Laurentide ice sheet, likely over the area of the Great Lakes or Hudson Bay. Imagine the scene. A multi-kilometer fragment of a comet strikes the 2-mile-thick ice sheet. The resulting explosion blasts a colossal spray of ice boulders, some the size of office buildings, on a ballistic suborbital trajectory. They travel for hundreds of miles before screaming back through the atmosphere, superheated and traveling at supersonic speeds. When this volley of icy shrapnel struck the soft, sandy sediments of the Atlantic coastal plain at a low angle, each piece carved out a shallow, elliptical depression, with the ejecta piling up to form the sandy rim on the far side. This single mechanism explains everything. It explains the elliptical shape, a classic feature of an oblique impact. It explains their uniform orientation. They are all pointing back toward a common point of origin in the northwest. It explains their vast number and distribution. It was a shotgun blast from space, and the Carolina Bays are the wounds. This explanation is not new. It was first proposed in the 1930s, and then systematically suppressed for decades because it required a catastrophe of a scale that the gradualist paradigm could not tolerate. The scandal is not that the wind and water theory is weak. The scandal is the institutional, century-long refusal to even seriously test the impact model. Uncomfortable quote from a fictionalized internal memo by a senior administrator at the U.S. Geological Survey in response to a proposal for LiDAR mapping of the bays to test the impact hypothesis, circa 1995. We need to shelve this. The impact origin for the bays is an embarrassing relic of 1930s-era catastrophism. The consensus for an Aeolian lacustrine model is well established. To lend the USGS's name and resources to an investigation of such a fringe, speculative idea would be to invite ridicule and damage the agency's credibility. It would be a monumental waste of taxpayer funds. Our official position is that these are oriented lakes. All future mapping projects should proceed from that established, non-controversial baseline. This is the sound of paradigm enforcement. It is an executive decision to not look for evidence that might upset the status quo. This is a phenomenon the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn called paradigm-induced blindness. A dominant scientific theory doesn't just provide answers. It dictates which questions are acceptable to ask and which evidence is allowed to be seen. Within the gradualist paradigm, a recent cosmic catastrophe is forbidden. Therefore, the Carolina Bays cannot be impact scars. Therefore, another explanation, no matter how physically absurd, must be the correct one. The long-term consequence is that generations of geologists have been trained to literally not see what is directly in front of them. They study these features, they map them, they write papers on them, but they are conceptually blind to their true nature because the answer lies outside the boundaries of their accepted reality. The bays are a message from a more violent past, written in a language the establishment refuses to learn. And they were not the only such message. At the very feet of the archaeologists fighting this war, there was another clue. A dark, consistent layer that marked the tombstone of a lost world. That dark message was not just written across the landscape in the form of the Carolina Bays. It was also laid down with funereal precision in the very soil that archaeologists were so carefully excavating. At dozens of late Pleistocene sites across North America, and now on other continents, a strange and consistent feature appears, always at the exact same point in the geological timeline. It is known as the black mat. It is a thin, dark, organic, rich layer, typically only a centimeter or two thick, that stands out like a slash of ink against the lighter-colored sediments surrounding it. Its position in the strata is brutally, unambiguously clear. Below the black mat, the world is teeming with life. You find the bones of mammoths, camels, and dire wolves. You find the signature fluted spear points of the Clovis people. It is a rich, vibrant record of a lost world. Then you hit the mat, and in the sediments directly above it, there is nothing. The megafauna are gone. The Clovis points are gone. It is a geological curtain falling on an entire epoch, The black mat is the tombstone of the North American Pleistocene, and its existence is an inconvenient fact that the scientific establishment has spent decades trying to explain away. The official orthodox explanation is, once again, a masterpiece of gradualist, non-threatening thinking. The black mat, they argue, is simply the result of a rising water table at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. The onset of the colder, wetter climate, they claim, created swamps, marshes, and soggy ground across the continent. This layer of black soil is just the accumulated gunk from those newly formed wetlands, algae, bacteria, and decaying plant matter in a low-oxygen environment. In this view, the mat is a consequence of the climate change, a simple environmental signal, nothing more. It's a neat story, and it is almost certainly wrong. To believe the official explanation is to believe that the water table rose synchronously across an entire continent, in environments as diverse as the arid deserts of Arizona, the plains of New Mexico, and the forests of Michigan. It's a hydrological absurdity. It is a localized explanation desperately misapplied to a continent-wide phenomenon. The impact hypothesis, however, provides a chillingly direct and coherent explanation. The black mat is the direct aftermath of the catastrophe. It is the fallout layer. It is composed of the soot and charcoal from the continent-spanning wildfires ignited by the cometary airbursts. This fallout, rich in carbon and other elements, would have poisoned the soil and water, creating the perfect conditions for massive algal and bacterial blooms in the post-apocalyptic ponds and wetlands. The mat marks the moment of destruction and the immediate poisoned environment that followed. It is not a sign of a gentle shift to a wetter climate. It is the settling dust of a nuclear winter. And crucially, it is within this very layer that the impact proponents found their toolkit of extraterrestrial evidence. The nanodiamonds, the magnetic spherules, the elevated iridium, they are all concentrated in the black mat. The mat is not just a tombstone, it is the forensic layer containing the murder weapon. For any archaeologist in the field, digging carefully through the layers of time, the starkness of this boundary is visceral. It's a feeling that the official wetlands theory simply cannot capture. Uncomfortable. Quote, from the private field journal of a veteran archaeologist excavating the Murray Springs Clovis site, dated 1982, finished exposing the contact today. It's like nothing I've ever seen. Below the black line, it's a butcher shop, mammoth bones, Clovis tools, the debris of a vibrant hunting culture. Then the line. It's sharp, maybe a centimeter thick, and above it, silence, emptiness. For a meter upwards, the soil is sterile of any real signs of life. The official line is that this is a pond deposit, an algal mat, but it doesn't feel like a pond deposit. It feels like a wound. It feels like the lights went out. We're taught to be objective to describe the sediments, but it's impossible to sit here in this trench and not feel like you are standing on the edge of a great abyss, a moment when the world broke. We're not allowed to talk like this in the papers we write, but there's a crime scene here and we are dutifully ignoring the body. This is the power of dogma. It can force you to deny the evidence of your own senses. The long-term consequence of the establishment is explaining away of the black mat is one of the great missed opportunities in modern science. For decades, the single most widespread and consistent piece of physical evidence for the Younger Dryas catastrophe was mislabeled. It was treated as a mundane geological feature, a simple curiosity. It was effectively neutralized, its terrifying message muffled by a boring, comfortable, and incorrect explanation. The clue was not just being ignored, it was being actively misunderstood. And this same pattern of misdirection and control was happening with the most prized data of all, the pristine samples of ancient ice and mud that held the ultimate record of the past, a record controlled by a handful of powerful institutions. The black mat and the Carolina Bays were powerful, damning clues, but the ultimate arbiter in any debate about Earth's past lies locked away in freezers in Colorado and Copenhagen. This is the priceless archive of ice cores drilled from the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets and the sediment cores pulled from the floors of the world's oceans. These cores are the gold standard of paleoclimatology. They are time capsules. Each layer of ice, each layer of mud, is a page from a history book, recording the atmospheric chemistry, temperature, and dust fall of a single year. A single, multi-kilometer-long ice core from Greenland is a continuous high-resolution record of the last 100,000 years of Earth's history. It is the planet's hard drive. And if a massive cometary impact and airburst event filled the northern hemisphere's atmosphere with soot, nanodiamonds, and exotic metals 12,800 years ago, the evidence, the smoking gun, would be frozen in a specific layer of that ice. Getting access to this evidence, however, is not a simple matter of scientific curiosity. These cores, drilled at a cost of tens of millions of dollars of public money, are controlled by a small, insular group of powerful institutions and the senior scientists who run them. They are the core keepers. Access to even a thimbleful of this precious ice is governed by committees, by formal proposals, and by the opaque internal politics of the scientific establishment. And here lies the central conflict of interest at the heart of this entire controversy. The very same scientists who sit on the committees that decide who gets to analyze the ice are the architects and chief defenders of the gradualist, meltwater pulse explanation for the Younger Dryas. Their careers, their reputations, and their legacies are built upon the data from these cores, interpreted in a way that explicitly excludes any form of cosmic catastrophe. They are not impartial judges. They are the defending champions in a title match, where they also get to decide if the challenger is even allowed in the ring. Predictably, when the impact proponents began submitting proposals in the late 2000s, requesting small samples of ice from the 12,800-year-old layer to test for nanodiamonds and other impact proxies, they were met with a wall of bureaucratic resistance. Their proposals were slow-walked, deemed too speculative, or denied on the grounds that the analysis techniques were too destructive. They were trapped in a perfect catch-22. The core keepers would demand extraordinary proof before they would grant access to the samples, but the proponents couldn't get that extraordinary proof without access to the samples. It was a strategy of perpetual delay and denial, a scientific embargo enforced not by reasoned argument, but by the control of a physical resource. The public's data, the planet's own historical record, was being held hostage to protect a dying paradigm. The official justifications for these denials were always couched in the bland, reasonable language of resource management, but the private conversations revealed the true political motive: to deny a rival theory the evidence it needed to prove its case. Uncomfortable. Quote, from the fictionalized but plausible minutes of a closed-door meeting of a U.S. Ice Core Sample Allocation Committee, debating a request from the Comet Research Group, we have to consider the stewardship of the core. This is an irreplaceable scientific resource. To grant a request for a destructive analysis based on a highly controversial, and frankly, fringe hypothesis is a high-risk, low-reward proposition. The proposers have yet to definitively prove their case in terrestrial sediments, so why should we allow them to test their theory on our most valuable asset? The potential for sample contamination from their methods is also a concern. I recommend we table this request indefinitely, pending a much broader consensus in the community. We can't be seen to be wasting this material chasing sensationalist ideas. The hypocrisy is stunning. The core is a resource for testing hypotheses, but it cannot be used to test this hypothesis because it is not yet proven. This is gatekeeping in its purest form. The long-term consequence of this data monopoly is the creation of a scientific feudalism. A handful of academic lords who control the priceless data can effectively starve out any researcher who dares to challenge their authority. They can dictate the direction of an entire field of science, not through the strength of their arguments, but through their grip on the archives. It ensures that the official story is never seriously challenged by the best and most direct evidence, allowing it to survive by default. The truth, frozen in a layer of 12,800-year-old ice, remained locked away in a freezer, protected by a phalanx of bureaucrats and career-minded scientists. Denied the smoking gun from the ice, the impact team had no choice but to return to the terrestrial crime scenes, to the mud and bones of the archaeological sites where the battle had first begun to build a case so overwhelming that not even the core keepers could ignore it forever. Denied access to the pristine record of the ice cores, the Comet Research Group was forced back onto the terrestrial battlefield. The war for the Younger Dryas would not be decided in a sterile laboratory with ice from Greenland, but in the dust and heat of a dry creek bed in southern Arizona. A single iconic archaeological site became the Verdun of this scientific war, a place where the two sides would dig in for a decade-long battle of attrition, fought with trowels, electron microscopes, and mass spectrometers. That place was Murray Springs. Murray Springs is a hallowed name in North American archaeology. It is one of the most famous and well-preserved Clovis sites ever discovered. In the 1960s, archaeologists unearthed a stunning tableau of Pleistocene life and death. The partial skeleton of a full-grown mammoth and the remains of several bison, directly associated with a cache of beautiful and deadly Clovis spear points. It was a snapshot of the world before the fall. And crucially, lying directly on top of these bones and artifacts was a perfect, undisturbed, and starkly visible example of the black mat. Murray Springs was the Rosetta Stone of the Younger Dryas boundary. It was the crime scene, preserved under a layer of geological caution tape. Because of its pristine nature, Murray Springs became the focal point of the entire impact debate. It was here, in that thin black layer, that the impact team first reported finding their entire suite of extraterrestrial markers: the nanodiamonds, the magnetic spherules, the carbon spherules, the soot, the iridium. It was their Exhibit A, and in turn, it was Murray Springs that the debunkers, led by Tyrone Dalton, specifically targeted. Their claim to have found no nanodiamonds at Murray Springs was the centerpiece of their celebrated killshot paper. For the next several years, this single patch of desert became a scientific battleground. The impact team would publish a paper presenting new data from the Murray Springs black mat. Months later, a rival team from the establishment would publish a counterpaper, often analyzing a sample taken mere meters away, claiming they could not replicate the findings. The debate descended into a kind of microscopic trench warfare. For example, the impact team identified millions of tiny magnetic spherules in the black mat. Under a scanning electron microscope, they showed that these spherules were not just ordinary terrestrial magnetite. They had textures indicating extremely rapid melting and cooling, and chemical signatures, enriched in elements like platinum and iridium, that pointed to a non-terrestrial origin. They were, the team argued, the condensed droplets of the cosmic impactor and the vaporized Earth it struck. The debunkers fired back. These spherules, they claimed, were nothing more than common industrial contaminants, welding spatter or fly ash from a power plant. Others argued they were cosmic dust that falls gently on the Earth every day, or even a form of bacteria that can process iron. The war was now being fought over the elemental composition of an object smaller than a grain of sand. The scandal here is not that there was a disagreement. The scandal is how two groups of highly trained experts, using the same sophisticated technology, could look at the same geological layer from the same famous site and produce such fundamentally irreconcilable results. It suggests that the conflict was no longer about objective discovery. It was about confirmation bias on an institutional scale, where each side was finding exactly what it wanted to find. The scientific method itself seemed to be breaking down under the political pressure. This toxic adversarial atmosphere took its toll, especially on the younger researchers caught in the crossfire, who had entered the field to pursue truth, not to fight a war. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative email from an exhausted graduate student to a friend outside of academia, circa 2012. I don't know what we're doing anymore. I spent the last 2 months on the SEM, imaging spherules from the Murray Springs sample. Every time I find one that fits the impact profile, my professor gets excited and tells me to document it for our next paper. But when I find a dozen that look more like common magnetite, he tells me to put them aside because they're probably contamination and not relevant. It doesn't feel like we're trying to figure out what happened anymore. It feels like we're lawyers, building a case for a client we've already decided is innocent. The other side is doing the exact same thing. It's not science. It's a blood feud, and we're the poor grunts sorting through the microscopic shrapnel. This is the sound of scientific idealism dying. The battle for Murray Springs illustrates the catastrophic breakdown of the process of building scientific consensus. Instead of different labs converging on a baseline of accepted facts, The research diverged into two completely separate parallel realities. The long-term consequence is a deep and lasting wound to the credibility of the entire field. The public looks at this spectacle and doesn't see a noble search for truth. They see a petty squabble, a team sport where the scoreboard matters more than the facts. The real victim was the mystery itself. What truly happened at Murray Springs 2,800 years ago became secondary to the question of which team of scientists would win the argument. But while the two sides were locked in their microscopic stalemate in the Arizona desert, the planet was about to reveal a new clue, a global fingerprint of the catastrophe that was too large and too chemically unambiguous for the debunkers to easily explain away. The microscopic trench warfare over Murray Springs had ground the debate to a stalemate. For every expert who claimed to see an impact marker, there was another who claimed it was contamination. The science was stuck in a political quagmire. What the impact proponents needed was a new line of evidence, a clue so clear, so unambiguous, and so geographically widespread that it couldn't be dismissed as a local anomaly or a methodological error. They found it in the form of a rare, precious metal. They found it in platinum. Platinum, along with its cousin iridium, belongs to a group of elements that are exceedingly rare in the Earth's crust. Our planet's supply of these metals sank to the core during its molten formation billions of years ago. Asteroids and comets, however, are cosmic leftovers from the formation of the solar system and are relatively rich in these platinum group metals. This is why the thin layer of iridium deposited around the world 66 million years ago was the definitive smoking gun for the asteroid impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. It was a global chemical fingerprint of an extraterrestrial killer. The impact team had initially looked for iridium at the Younger Dryas boundary, but the signal was weak and easily contested. Platinum, it turned out, was the key. The breakthrough came in 2013, and it came from the one place the establishment thought was their impregnable fortress, the Greenland ice cores. A team of scientists, working independently of the original Comet Research Group, published a stunning finding. They had analyzed the ice from the GISP-2 core, the holy grail of climate data, and they had discovered a massive, undeniable spike in platinum concentration, beginning and peaking at precisely the 12,800-year layer that marks the onset of the Younger Dryas. The core keepers had been outmaneuvered. The evidence wasn't coming from some dusty archaeological site in Arizona. It was coming from their own pristine, sacred ice. The implications were staggering. A platinum spike recorded in the Greenland ice sheet is not a local event. It means a dust cloud enriched with extraterrestrial platinum was distributed across the entire northern hemisphere, settling out of the atmosphere and being preserved in the annual layers of snow. There is no known terrestrial mechanism, no volcano, no strange geological process that can create such a sudden, concentrated platinum anomaly in the ice. The source had to be from space. This discovery opened the floodgates. Now that scientists knew exactly what to look for, they started finding the platinum spike everywhere. It was found in the black mat at Murray Springs, vindicating the impact team's earlier work. It was found at more than 24 other Younger Dryas boundary sites across North America. But it didn't stop there. The same platinum anomaly was found in a sediment core from a lake in southern Mexico. It was found in South America. It was found in Europe. It was found in Western Asia. The fingerprint of the catastrophe was global. This single piece of geochemical evidence transformed the entire debate. The nanodiamonds could be argued over. The spherules could be dismissed as contaminants. But a synchronous global platinum spike is a fact of a different order of magnitude. It is a planetary event marker. The establishment, which had so confidently declared victory after the nanodiamond debunking, was now caught flat-footed. They couldn't ignore the data, so they were forced to try and explain it away. A task that grew more difficult with every new core sample that came back from the lab. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized internal email exchange between two senior geochemists known for their opposition to the impact hypothesis circa 2014. Subject, this new platinum paper. This. Mark, did you see this? They've found the platinum spike in the Cariaco Basin now. This is becoming a real problem. Reply. I saw it. It's not good. The Greenland data was bad enough. but having it show up in multiple hemispheres on a synchronous timeline is going to be very difficult to counter. We need a terrestrial model for PGM concentration during anoxic boundary events, maybe some kind of chemical migration in the sediment that concentrates background levels, or a series of unusual volcanic eruptions. I know it's a stretch, but we have to propose an alternative. We can't let the impact narrative become the default explanation for this. This is the sound of a paradigm beginning to break. We have to propose an alternative. It is an admission that they no longer control the conversation. The power of a single, clear, globally distributed piece of data is that it cuts through the noise. The esoteric arguments over electron microscope images were a fog of war that allowed the establishment to confuse the issue. A platinum spike is a clear signal. It is a number from a machine. While politics and personality can dominate a scientific controversy for years, hard data, when it is clear enough and comes from enough independent sources, can eventually become undeniable. The platinum anomaly didn't end the war, but it was the turning of the tide. It proved that the event at the Younger Dryas boundary was not a regional North American affair. It was a global cataclysm, and that realization would force researchers to look for its scars in the one place everyone assumed they understood: the cradle of civilization itself. The global platinum fingerprint proved that the Younger Dryas cataclysm was not a provincial American event. It was a planetary catastrophe. This realization forced a radical expansion of the search for evidence, taking investigators from the Clovis sites of the New World to the very cradle of civilization in the Old. Their destination was a place called Abu Huraira, an archaeological site on the banks of the Euphrates River in modern-day Syria. Before it was flooded by the waters of the Assad Dam in the 1970s, Abu Huraira was one of the most important prehistoric sites ever excavated. It contained a priceless, continuous record of one of the most important transitions in human history: the birth of agriculture. The site had two layers. The first was a village of hunter-gatherers, known as Natufians, who lived a settled life harvesting the wild grains and grasses that grew in abundance. Then abruptly, that first village vanishes and is replaced by a second, a new settlement of the world's first farmers. This transition at Abu Huraira is a textbook chapter in the story of the Neolithic Revolution. For years, the evidence from the site sat in museum archives. But armed with the new knowledge of impact proxies, a team of scientists, including James Kennett from the original impact group, decided to take another look. They focused on the thin boundary layer that separated the final moments of the hunter-gatherer village from the layers above. And what they found, in a paper published in 2020, was a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the world of archaeology. At the 12,800-year-old boundary, they found the entire unmistakable toolkit of a cosmic impact. They found the platinum spike, linking the site directly to the global event. They found the nano-diamonds. They found the magnetic and carbon spherules, but they also found something new and terrifying: melt glass. They found evidence that the mud brick walls of the ancient village huts, along with the soil and plants, had been instantaneously heated to over 2,200 degrees Celsius, melting them into glass. A cooking fire or a normal village fire cannot do this. This is the temperature of an industrial furnace, the temperature of an exploding cosmic body. The conclusion was inescapable and horrifying. The first village at Abu Huraira was not abandoned. It was annihilated. It was struck directly by one of the air-bursting fragments of the Younger Dryas comet. The cradle of civilization was a ground zero. This discovery did more than just widen the geographical scope of the impact. It struck at the heart of our most fundamental story about human progress. The traditional narrative of the Neolithic Revolution is one of proactive human genius. Our clever ancestors, tired of the uncertainties of hunting and gathering, made a brilliant intellectual leap. They figured out how to domesticate plants and animals, thus seizing control of their own food supply and paving the way for villages, cities, and everything we call civilization. It is our origin myth. Abu Huraira suggests a much darker and more dramatic story. It suggests that agriculture was not a brilliant invention born of leisure, but a desperate improvisation born of utter necessity. The impact and the subsequent 300-year winter of the Younger Dryas would have destroyed the wild grasses and roaming herds the Natufians depended on. The survivors of the apocalypse, starving in a shattered world, were forced to adopt a new, more labor-intensive survival strategy: farming. The guardians of Near Eastern archaeology, who had curated the story of the Neolithic for a century, reacted with predictable fury to this narrative vandalism. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized private letter from a senior professor of Near Eastern archaeology to a colleague, shortly after the Abu Huraira paper was published. This is an outrage. These impact people, having failed to definitively prove their case in America, have now decided to export their ridiculous catastrophe narrative to our region. They have taken one of our most important sites and twisted it to fit their sensationalist agenda. The story of the Neolithic in the Fertile Crescent is a story of human innovation, of cultural and environmental adaptation over millennia. It is not the backdrop for some Hollywood disaster movie. To suggest that agriculture was the result of a lucky few surviving a comet strike is an insult to the generations of careful scholarship that have built our field. This is not science. It is a hostile academic takeover. A hostile academic takeover. He's not wrong. It is. But that doesn't mean it's incorrect. The meta-commentary here is about the power of origin myths. The story of the agricultural revolution as a peaceful, intellectual achievement is a foundational myth of our modern world. It reassures us that progress is our natural state, that we are masters of our own destiny. The evidence from Abu Huraira threatens to replace that comforting story with a terrifying one, that our civilization is not the product of a brilliant idea, but the post-traumatic response of a nearly extinct species. It suggests we are the descendants of the shell-shocked survivors of a global catastrophe, and that our entire way of life was born from their desperate struggle to survive in the brutal winter that followed. The very foundation of our world, it seems, may be a tombstone. With the footprint of the catastrophe now identified from the plains of Arizona to the banks of the Euphrates and its chemical signature logged in the ice of Greenland, the official story for the Younger Dryas was facing a crisis of credibility. Let's return to that story for a moment. The convenient alibi, the establishment's preferred culprit, the bursting of a giant glacial lake in North America, a freshwater flood that disrupted the currents of the North Atlantic and plunged the world into winter. For decades, this meltwater pulse theory was presented not as a hypothesis but as an established fact. It was the bedrock of the orthodox explanation, a terrestrial, manageable, and comfortably non-cosmic cause for the cold snap. But in the face of the new global evidence, this convenient alibi doesn't just look weak. It looks like a deliberate fiction, a desperate placeholder for a truth the establishment has refused to confront. Let's be clear, the meltwater pulse theory is a regional explanation for a global event. It is like blaming a thunderstorm in Texas for a simultaneous power outage in China. It simply cannot account for the geographic scale of the evidence. How precisely does a flood of fresh water into the North Atlantic Ocean cause a platinum spike to be deposited in the Andes Mountains of South America? How does a shutdown of the ocean conveyor belt cause a village in Syria to be flash melted into glass? The theory has nothing to say. It is geographically incoherent. Even in its own backyard, the theory is failing. The geological evidence for a single catastrophic flood of the right size, from the right place at the exact right time, remains stubbornly ambiguous and highly contested. Geologists cannot agree on the definitive flood path that supposedly changed the world. The official story's smoking gun is missing, but the theory's most glaring failure is its explanatory impotence. The meltwater pulse, at best, offers a potential mechanism for the cooling of the Younger Dryas. That is all it does. It offers absolutely no explanation for any of the other synchronous events that define the Younger Dryas boundary. It cannot explain the instantaneous extinction of 36 genera of large mammals across North America. It cannot explain the continent-spanning layer of soot and charcoal that points to massive wildfires. It cannot explain the discovery of nanodiamonds and other shock-synthesized materials. It cannot explain the physical destruction and burning of human settlements. It explains the symptom, the cold, while ignoring the brutal, violent wound that caused it. The continued adherence to this failed model is no longer a matter of scientific conservatism. It is an act of institutional denialism on a breathtaking scale. The meltwater pulse theory is a zombie. It has been decisively killed by the evidence, yet it continues to shamble through the corridors of academia and the pages of textbooks because the alternative is simply too terrible for the orthodoxy to accept. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized transcript of a senior paleoclimatologist speaking at a closed-door workshop on Younger Dryas controversies, circa 2017. We all see the same data. Of course, the simple meltwater pulse model can't account for the platinum or the other geochemical anomalies. It's obvious. But we have to be responsible here. What happens if we publicly abandon the model? We create a vacuum. And that vacuum will be filled instantly and completely by the impact fantasists. We will lose control of the narrative. Right now, the meltwater pulse, for all its flaws, is the only coherent terrestrial alternative on the table. It is our responsibility to refine it and defend it. To do otherwise would be to effectively surrender the entire field to a group of catastrophists, and that is a concession I am not prepared to make. Lose control of the narrative. That is what this has always been about. This is a stunning admission that the theory is being kept alive not because it is a good explanation, but because it is a useful political tool, an intellectual firewall. The meltwater pulse theory was never meant to be a perfect explanation of the facts. It was a placeholder, a safe, earth-based story designed specifically to hold the line against the terrifying possibility of a cosmic encounter. The devastating long-term consequence of this strategy is decades of wasted time and intellectual stagnation. By clinging to their zombie theory, the gatekeepers of climate science actively obstructed the investigation into the true nature of one of the most significant climate events in recent geological history. They weren't trying to solve the puzzle. They were trying to ensure that the most important piece, the piece that fell from the sky, was never allowed to be placed on the board. And they enforced this stagnation using their most powerful weapon, their control over the official record of science itself. A failed theory like the meltwater pulse can only survive as a zombie if it is protected by the highest authorities. In science, the highest authorities are the editors and peer reviewers of the major scientific journals. Publications like Nature, Science, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences are the gatekeepers of the official record. They are the Vatican of scientific knowledge. Their imprimatur transforms a mere finding into an accepted fact. From the very beginning, these powerful institutions chose a side in the Younger Dryas War, and they wielded their immense power not to facilitate an honest debate, but to strangle the impact hypothesis in its cradle. This was not a passive bias. It was an active and arguably collusive campaign to block the publication of dissenting research. The primary weapon in this campaign was the perversion of the peer review process. Peer review is supposed to be a system of quality control, where a paper is vetted by impartial experts in the field. In the hands of a biased editor, however, it becomes a tool of censorship. When a paper supporting the Younger Dryas Impact was submitted, it would invariably be sent to a hand-picked list of the theory's most vocal and hostile public opponents. This is the equivalent of sending a political dissident's appeal to be reviewed by the chief of the secret police. The outcome is preordained. The reviews would come back not as constructive criticism, but as scathing, dismissive, and often deeply personal attacks. Armed with these manufactured negative reviews, the editor could then reject the paper with a clean conscience, claiming to be upholding the rigorous standards of the journal. For the impact proponents, the goalposts were constantly being moved. When they presented the nanodiamonds, the debunkers demanded they be found by other teams using different methods. When the platinum spike was found in the ice cores by an independent team, the critics suddenly argued that a platinum spike wasn't definitive proof of an impact after all. They were forced to meet an impossible standard of proof, one that was never applied to the orthodox theories. Meanwhile, papers that attacked the impact hypothesis or supported the increasingly feeble meltwater pulse theory sailed through a much friendlier process. They were often sent to like-minded colleagues in a process of institutional back-scratching known as PAL review. The result was a deeply skewed scientific record, where evidence against the impact was amplified and promoted, while evidence for it was marginalized, delayed for years, or buried completely. This systemic bias, this rigging of the game, was an open secret within the community, a cynical reality of the power dynamics that govern the supposedly objective world of science. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative confidential email from the senior editor of a prestigious geology journal to a trusted colleague on the editorial board, circa 2015. John, I've got another one of these damned comet papers. This one is on the platinum anomaly from a site in Belgium. The data looks clean, I'll admit, but we can't let this stuff get a foothold. The last thing we need is another 3 years of online flame wars. I'm going to send it to Redacted, he'll know how to kill it. His last review on the topic was a work of art. We need to find a fatal flaw in the methodology, something we can hang the rejection on without looking like we're censoring them. Let me know if you have any other ideas for who could give this the scrutiny it deserves. He'll know how to kill it. This is the language of a conspiracy, not of an open intellectual inquiry. The scandal here is a profound betrayal of public trust. We fund science with our tax dollars on the understanding that it is a search for truth. But the gatekeepers of publication have demonstrated that they are often more interested in protecting the stability of the current consensus. The meta-commentary is that we must disabuse ourselves of the romantic notion that these journals are simply noble platforms for the dissemination of knowledge. They are powerful multi-billion-dollar brands. Their authority, their prestige, and their revenue are all tied to their role as the arbiters of the scientific consensus. A radical, paradigm-shattering theory is a direct threat to that stability. It creates controversy. It challenges the authority of the experts the journals rely on, and it risks making the journal look foolish if the new theory is later proven wrong. There is a powerful institutional and financial incentive to be conservative, to side with the establishment, and to suppress disruptive ideas. The long-term consequence is that the official scientific record is not a perfect mirror of reality. It is a curated, edited, and often politically manipulated document, a history written by the winners. And the question we must ask is, what deeper truth, what darker narrative were they so desperate to keep from being written into that record? So what is this deeper truth, this darker narrative that the scientific establishment and its gatekeepers in the world of publishing have fought so viciously to suppress? The unprecedented resistance to the Younger Dryas Impact hypothesis cannot be explained by mere scientific disagreement. It is too personal, too political, too vitriolic. To understand the true source of the opposition, we have to look beyond the data and into the realm of foundational myth. The impact hypothesis does not just threaten a scientific theory. In North America, it threatens a national identity. It is a direct assault on the cherished foundational myth of the American continent as a new world. This is the story of manifest destiny, the narrative woven into the very fabric of the nation's psyche. The idea of a vast, pristine, and largely empty wilderness, a virgin continent waiting patiently for millennia, for European pioneers to arrive and tame it to bring history and progress to a land that had none. It is a powerful and politically convenient creation myth, and the Younger Dryas Impact takes a stick of dynamite to it. The impact hypothesis recasts North America in a radically different and far more tragic light. It suggests that far from being a quiet, ahistorical backwater, the continent was the epicenter of a planetary cataclysm. It posits that a sophisticated and successful human culture, the Clovis people who had conquered the continent in a geological instant, were not just displaced but annihilated, erased from the earth in a flash of fire and a subsequent millennium of ice. The theory implies that a great reset button was pushed on North America 800 years ago. The vast, seemingly empty wilderness that greeted European settlers was not the continent's original state. It was a post-apocalyptic landscape, an ecosystem still recovering from a near-total sterilization event. The great herds of megafauna were gone. The human population had been decimated and the very soil was scarred. America was not a new world. It was a haunted world, a widow. This narrative is profoundly destabilizing to the traditional American story. It replaces the triumphant march of the pioneer with a ghost story. It suggests that the continent's history is not a linear tale of uninterrupted progress from savage to civilized, but a broken story with a lost chapter of unimaginable trauma right in the middle. The psychological and cultural resistance to this idea cannot be overstated. The scientific objections to the data, while framed in the language of methodology and replication, are often a proxy for this deeper, unspoken cultural revulsion. The theory is not just scientifically inconvenient, it is mythologically blasphemous. This cultural anxiety, this fear of a rewritten national narrative, can be seen in the private concerns of those who see themselves as the custodians of that narrative. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized private letter from an influential American historian to a major philanthropic foundation considering a grant for Younger Dryas archaeological research, circa 2016. While the scientific questions are intriguing, we must consider the broader cultural implications of popularizing this impact theory. It has a deeply pessimistic, even nihilistic, undertone. It replaces the story of human agency and pioneering spirit, which is so central to our national character, with a narrative of cosmic victimhood. It robs the North American continent of its unique identity as a land of new beginnings, and reframes it as a place of ancient tragedy. I fear that elevating this hypothesis from the fringe to the mainstream could have a destabilizing effect on our public historical consciousness. There is a responsibility to consider the narrative consequences of the science we choose to fund. The narrative consequences of the science we choose to fund. This lays bare the ugly truth. The fight over the Younger Dryas has always been a proxy war over something much bigger. It is a battle over the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. Science is never conducted in a political or cultural vacuum. The questions we ask, the evidence we're willing to see, and the conclusions we're willing to accept are all shaped by the foundational myths of our society. The long-term consequence of this cultural blindness is a profound historical amnesia. By clinging to the comforting myth of a virgin wilderness, we have refused to engage with the possibility of a much deeper, more traumatic, and more interesting past. We have ignored the ghosts. But the Younger Dryas impact poses a threat that is even more immediate and more terrifying than rewriting the past. It threatens our entire conception of the future and our illusion of safety in the present. The Younger Dryas impact doesn't just threaten our creation myths. It threatens our most cherished modern myth, the myth of security. It forces us to confront the terrifying fragility of our planet and our civilization. This, perhaps more than any academic squabble or cultural anxiety, is the deepest and most fiercely guarded secret of the entire controversy. The fierce opposition is not just about protecting a narrative of the past. It is about maintaining a carefully constructed illusion about the safety of the present. For most of our lives, the idea of a catastrophic cosmic impact has been safely quarantined in the distant past. The asteroid that killed the dinosaurs struck 66 million years ago. It's an almost abstract concept, a dramatic but comfortably remote event that has no real bearing on our modern lives. But the Younger Dryas impact is a monster of a different kind. 12,800 years ago is not a geological abstraction. It is yesterday. It is a time when fully modern humans, our direct ancestors, were spread across the globe. An impact of that magnitude happening so recently in our own human story transforms the threat from a historical curiosity into an urgent and ongoing existential risk. It means that the planetary shooting gallery is still open. It means it happened to them, and it can happen to us. Furthermore, the nature of the proposed Younger Dryas impactor, a large fragmented comet, is a far more insidious and complex threat than a single solid asteroid. An asteroid can, in theory, be detected decades or even centuries away, its orbit precisely calculated, giving us time to formulate a plan. A fragmenting comet is a dirty snowball of ice and rock that can break apart as it approaches the sun, unleashing an unpredictable swarm of debris. It is not a bullet. It is a shotgun blast. Defending against such a threat is an order of magnitude more difficult. The danger is not just a single point on a telescope image. It is a diffuse and chaotic field of debris that the Earth might pass through. What would happen if our governments, our institutions, our entire global civilization were forced to officially acknowledge this truth? To admit that a civilization-ending event not only can happen, but that it happened in our own backyard just a few hundred generations ago? The consequences would be catastrophic in their own right. The potential for mass public panic, for a kind of fatalistic, apocalyptic dread to seep into the cultural consciousness, is immense. It would create a level of social and psychological instability that no government wants to manage. The economic fallout would be equally severe. The entire architecture of our global economy is built on a foundation of long-term predictability. How do you price a 30-year mortgage or a 100-year infrastructure bond in a world that officially admits it could be globally reset at any moment? The truth of our cosmic vulnerability is, quite simply, too expensive to acknowledge. This is where the academic controversy bleeds into the realm of unspoken state policy. The suppression of the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis may not just be the work of a few stubborn geologists. It may serve the interests of those whose primary job is to maintain social order and economic stability at all costs. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but plausible abstract of a confidential report by a geopolitical strategy think tank to a national security agency, titled Information Hazards and Existential Risk Management. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, YDIH, regardless of its ultimate scientific validity, presents a significant information hazard. Official validation of the theory that a civilization-disrupting cosmic event occurred in the recent Holocene would constitute a Class 1 destabilizing revelation. Our modeling predicts that widespread public acceptance could trigger severe economic contraction and social unrest. It is strategically inadvisable for any state actor to legitimize this narrative. We recommend a policy of managed skepticism, wherein the official stance is to encourage further debate, thus containing the hypothesis within the realm of academic controversy and preventing it from solidifying into a public panic-inducing fact. Managed skepticism, a policy of keeping the truth trapped in a perpetual state of academic debate so that you never have to deal with its consequences. This is the dark heart of the matter. The meta-commentary here is on the chilling concept of an information hazard, a piece of true information that is deemed too dangerous for the public to know. Our governments, obsessed with quarterly growth reports and 4-year election cycles, have no incentive to confront a problem like this. It is too big, too expensive, and too terrifying. The easier path is to implicitly encourage the suppression of the data, to allow the academic gatekeepers to do their dirty work, all to protect us from a truth they have decided we cannot handle. The long-term consequence is that we are living in a state of manufactured ignorance. We are being prevented from having the most important conversation in human history, what to do about our shared vulnerability as a species, because that conversation is not on the approved agenda. The conversation is not on the agenda because the price of admission is too high. Acknowledging the truth of the Younger Dryas impact isn't just a matter of psychological adjustment, it's a matter of fiscal revolution. A real planetary defense system capable of protecting us from a future Younger Dryas type event would be the single most expensive and complex engineering project in human history. We are not talking about a few more telescopes. We are talking about a permanent planetary scale security shield. Imagine a global network of deep space infrared satellites designed to hunt for the dark, cold comets that our current systems are blind to. Imagine a fleet of rapid response probe and characterization vehicles, ready to launch at a moment's notice to analyze a newly discovered threat. And imagine a globally distributed arsenal of heavy lift interceptors, massive rockets armed with multi-megaton nuclear warheads, hypervelocity kinetic impactors, or standoff laser systems, all poised for launch, all controlled by a complex and politically fraught international command structure. The price tag for such a system would not be in the billions, it would be in the trillions, possibly tens of trillions of dollars invested over decades. And this is the ugly, pragmatic secret at the heart of the resistance. That kind of money can only come from one place: the existing gargantuan defense budgets of the world's superpowers. You cannot simultaneously fund a new generation of aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, and missile submarines, while also building a comprehensive defense shield against the sky. It is a zero-sum game. And this means that the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, a seemingly obscure academic theory about prehistory, is a direct, and mortal threat to the most powerful political and industrial entity on Earth, the military-industrial complex. This global network of defense contractors, military bureaucracies, and political allies has an existential need for a specific kind of threat. It requires a human enemy. It requires rival nations, ideological conflicts, and terrestrial battlefields to justify its existence and its multi-trillion-dollar annual budget. A cosmic threat is the wrong kind of enemy. It is apolitical. It is impersonal. It doesn't have a flag or an ideology. It cannot be deterred by conventional forces. If the public were to become convinced that the greatest existential threat to their nation's survival was a random object from the Oort cloud, the political pressure to divert a significant portion of the defense budget toward planetary defense would be overwhelming. This would be an extinction-level event for the business model of conventional warfare. Programs would be canceled, contracts would be lost, profits would evaporate. The small-scale planetary defense initiatives we see today, like NASA's successful DART mission, are wonderful proof of concepts, but they are also token gestures. Public relations exercises designed to create the illusion of safety while consuming a rounding error of the federal budget. The real powers that be have a vested financial interest in ensuring the threat from the sky remains firmly in the realm of science fiction, uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative off-the-record conversation between a senior executive at a top 5 defense contracting firm and a high-ranking Pentagon official at a private dinner. Look, we're obviously tracking the public chatter on this comet stuff, and frankly, it's getting a little concerning. The narrative is starting to shift. If people start to believe the real threat is up there, it's going to get a lot harder to justify the budget for next-generation strategic platforms down here. We need to ensure Congress stays focused on the real world, near-peer competitor threats that require a robust and immediate conventional response. This planetary defense conversation, while interesting, is a dangerous distraction from a readiness perspective. It could negatively impact public and congressional support for essential deterrent programs that keep us safe today. A dangerous distraction. The cynicism is breathtaking. The primary business of the military-industrial complex is the management of terrestrial conflict, and business is good. The long-term consequence of this is a catastrophic misalignment of our species' survival priorities. Our defense spending is a reflection of what we fear most. For 70 years, we have been told to fear the nation on the other side of the border. We have spent unimaginable fortunes creating weapons to defend ourselves from each other. In doing so, we have created a self-perpetuating system of power and profit that requires the continued existence of human enemies. We have left ourselves almost completely defenseless against a scientifically established, recurring and species-ending threat. Because protecting ourselves from that threat doesn't fit the prevailing business model. It is a profound institutional madness, and this modern powerful dogma has a strange historical parallel, another rigid belief system that the impact hypothesis also threatens to shatter. That modern dogma, the military-industrial complex's need for a specific kind of terrestrial enemy, has a strange and powerful historical parallel within the very disciplines fighting the Younger Dryas War. For most of the 20th century, North American archaeology was ruled by its own rigid, unquestionable, and ruthlessly enforced doctrine. It was a theory so powerful and so entrenched that it functioned less like a scientific hypothesis and more like a state religion. It was called Clovis First. The theory was seductively simple and elegant. It stated that the first human beings to enter the American continents arrived no earlier than 13,500 years ago. They were a single group of Siberian big-game hunters who crossed the Bering Land Bridge into Alaska, and then, when the great continental ice sheets parted, moved south through a so-called ice-free corridor. These people, identified by their distinctive fluted spear points, were the Clovis culture. In a geological blink of an eye, this small founding population supposedly exploded across 2 continents, giving rise to all the subsequent indigenous cultures of the Americas. For nearly a century, this was it. This was the official, unchallengeable story of the peopling of the New World. The enforcement of this dogma was brutal. To be an archaeologist in the 20th century and to claim you had found evidence of human beings in the Americas before Clovis was to commit career suicide. A generation of archaeologists saw their findings ridiculed and their careers destroyed for daring to question the doctrine. Sites that produced pre-Clovis dates, like the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania or the Topper site in South Carolina, were subjected to decades of relentless, bad faith criticism. The artifacts were dismissed as geofacts, rocks that just happened to look like tools. The carbon dating was explained away as contamination. The high priests of the Clovis First religion, a handful of powerful tenured professors at major universities, acted as a kind of intellectual inquisition, stamping out heresy wherever it appeared. They controlled the journals, the funding agencies, and the academic departments. Their power was absolute. Into this fiercely guarded theological landscape, the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis arrived as the ultimate blasphemy. It threatened the Clovis First dogma in two fundamental ways. First, and most obviously, it proposed the annihilation of the Clovis people themselves. In the impact narrative, the first Americans were not the successful progenitors of all who came after. They were a tragic dead end, a culture erased from the earth. This removes the central protagonist from the sacred story. But more subtly, the impact hypothesis creates a logical space for a pre-Clovis population. A single small founding group like the Clovis First model proposed would have been incredibly vulnerable to a continental-scale cataclysm. For humanity to have survived in the Americas at all, it's far more likely that multiple, diverse, and geographically widespread populations were already in place before the impact, with some managing to survive in protected refugia. The impact story, in other words, works much better if Clovis wasn't first. The intellectual immune system of the archaeological establishment, which reacted with such speed and fury to the impact hypothesis, was already primed. It had been fighting a long, dirty war against the pre-Clovis heretics for 50 years. The impact proponents were just the latest and most dangerous in a long line of threats to their crumbling intellectual fortress. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative conversation between a powerful senior archaeologist and a promising graduate student, overheard at a conference in the late 1970s. Son, I've seen your field notes on that lower stratum. I know what you think you found. Let me give you some friendly advice. Forget about it. Your career is just beginning. Do you want to spend the next 30 years being known as that pre-Clovis guy? You'll never get a tenure-track job. You'll never get a major grant. Your papers will be rejected by every serious journal. The Clovis First model is the foundation. It works. It's clean. It's defensible. Our job is to build upon that foundation, not to take a sledgehammer to it. Drop it. For your own good. This is the voice of dogma. It is a threat disguised as mentorship. The long-term consequence of the Clovis First doctrine was the stagnation of an entire field of science for the better part of a century. The fascinating, complex, and now increasingly obvious story of the peopling of the Americas was kept artificially simplified. Its timeline arbitrarily shortened, all to protect the legacy of the theory's original architects. The war against the impact hypothesis was, in many ways, just a new front in this older, bitter civil war. But while the archaeologists were busy defending their sacred timeline, a discovery of incredible significance was about to be made, not in the dirt of an archaeological site, but buried under 2 miles of solid ice, in the one place on Earth where a secret of this magnitude could be kept. While the archaeologists and geochemists were locked in their bitter trench warfare over the terrestrial evidence, another group of scientists, with no allegiance in this fight, were about to stumble upon the secret that lay buried beneath it all. In 2015, a team of glaciologists flying over northwestern Greenland as part of a NASA mission were using a powerful new ice-penetrating radar to map the bedrock hidden beneath the massive Hiawatha Glacier. On their screens, a ghostly image began to emerge from the data. It was a feature of breathtaking scale and perfection. A massive, perfectly circular depression in the bedrock, 31 kilometers, or 19 miles, from rim to rim. It was a shape that should not have been there. There are no known geological or volcanic processes that create such a vast and flawless circle. They had found it. After a decade of critics taunting the impact proponents with the question, if a cataclysm happened, where is the crater? These scientists had found the smoking gun. Published in a blockbuster paper in November 2018, the discovery of the Hiawatha impact crater was the bombshell the impact theory had been waiting for. The evidence was overwhelming. The radar scans revealed a raised rim and a distinct central uplift, classic features of a complex impact structure. To confirm its origin, the researchers analyzed the sediments being washed out from under the glacier by meltwater streams. In these outwash plains, they found shocked quartz, a form of the mineral that can only be created by the extreme pressures of a cosmic impact. And they found a chemical spike of heavy metals, nickel, cobalt, chromium, and most tellingly platinum, all consistent with the impact of a rare iron-rich asteroid, an object that would have been roughly 1.5 kilometers wide. The location was, for the impact hypothesis, almost too good to be true. A massive impact on the northwestern edge of the Greenland ice sheet is the perfect kill mechanism. It would have sent unimaginable thermal and seismic shocks through the ice, destabilizing the entire sheet. It would have vaporized billions of tons of water, injecting it into the stratosphere to trigger catastrophic climate effects. And it was in the perfect location to have blasted a shotgun spray of glacier ice ejecta across the continent, carving out the Carolina bays as it landed. For the first time, all the disparate, confusing pieces of the puzzle, the nanodiamonds in Arizona, the melt glass in Syria, the platinum in the ice cores, the strange elliptical scars on the Atlantic coast, could be traced back to a single violent point of origin. The heretics, it seemed, had been vindicated in the most spectacular way imaginable. The announcement sent a seismic shockwave through the scientific establishment. They had spent a decade building a fortress of skepticism, with the missing crater as its central keep. Suddenly, that keep was a smoldering ruin. Their reaction was not one of scientific curiosity or cautious excitement at a potential solution to a great mystery. It was one of pure panicked damage control. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative frantic email circulated among a group of prominent YDIH critics on the day the Hiawatha crater paper was released. Everyone needs to read this immediately. It's worse than we thought. The media is going to run wild with it. We cannot let them connect this to the Younger Dryas. Our entire counter-argument for the last 10 years has been, no crater. We need to get ahead of this, and we need to do it now. The key is the age. The paper is cagey on the dating. We need to frame this as an interesting but ancient feature. We focus the public narrative exclusively on the uncertainty of the age. We hit that point, and we hit it hard. We must sever the link between this crater and 12,800 years ago before it becomes cemented in the public mind. This is the sound of a paradigm in its death throes. The immediate goal was not to understand the new discovery, but to politically contain it. The meta-commentary here is on the raw power of a single tangible piece of evidence. The fight over spherules in geochemistry was a war fought in the esoteric fog of the laboratory. It was easy to confuse and dismiss. A 19-mile-wide crater that you can see on a map is different. It is visceral. It is simple. It is a story that the public can understand instantly. The establishment knew that this discovery had the power to break through the academic noise and settle the debate in the court of public opinion. The long-term consequence of the Hiawatha discovery is that it fundamentally and permanently altered the landscape of the debate. The impact proponents no longer had to prove that an impact happened. Now the burden of proof had shifted to the establishment. They had to prove that this massive, perfectly located hole in the ground wasn't the one, and they would attack that problem with a desperate, single-minded focus. The establishment's panicked strategy, as revealed in their immediate, frantic communications, was to sever the link between the Hiawatha crater and the Younger Dryas event. Their weapon of choice was the complex and esoteric science of geological dating. If they could prove the crater was ancient, then it could be dismissed as a spectacular but irrelevant coincidence. The challenge, of course, is that you cannot simply walk up to a crater buried under more than 1 kilometer of solid ice and carbon date it. Its age must be inferred through clever, indirect, and highly debatable methods. There are essentially 2 ways to do it. The first is to analyze the ice itself. The Greenland ice sheet is a timeline, with the oldest layers at the bottom and the youngest at the top. If the deep, ancient layers of ice directly over the crater are continuous and undisturbed, it suggests the crater was there before the ice formed. If, however, those bottom layers are jumbled, melted, and refrozen, it implies an impact that punched through an existing ice sheet. The second method is to analyze the rock and sand that was thrown out by the impact and is now being washed out from under the glacier. The scientific orthodoxy, with the full backing of the major funding agencies, immediately poured resources into studies designed to produce an ancient date. The counterattack was swift and well publicized. In 2022, a major paper announced that they had dated sand grains found in the outwash from the Hiawatha crater. Using a technique called luminescence dating, which can tell you when a grain of sand was last exposed to sunlight, they arrived at an age of at least 58,000 years. Another study analyzing the radar layers of the ice flowing over the crater argued that the layers, while deformed, were not fundamentally disrupted in the way one would expect from a recent massive impact. The headlines once again wrote themselves, "Hiawatha crater is ancient. New study disconnects crater from controversial impact theory." The establishment had its story. The crater was old. The case was closed. Again. But this was, once again, a masterclass in motivated reasoning and scientific misdirection. Let's take the sand. Finding 58,000-year-old sand in the ejecta of a crater does not mean the crater is 58,000 years old. An impact is an excavation event. It digs a massive hole and throws out whatever material was already there. To find ancient sand in the debris of a recent impact is not just possible, it is expected. The institutional push to get a specific old answer was palpable. The survival of the entire gradualist paradigm depended on disarming the Hiawatha bombshell. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized internal memorandum at a national science funding agency, discussing which Hiawatha-related research to prioritize, circa 2019. Given the significant disruption caused by the 2018 discovery, it is a strategic priority to fund proposals that aim to definitively resolve the crater's age. Proposals that utilize novel dating techniques with a high probability of constraining the impact event to the pre-Holocene, i.e., older than 11,700 years, should be fast-tracked. A definitive old age is the most efficient path to restoring stability within the quaternary research community and allowing us to move past the distracting and unproductive impact narrative that has dominated the last decade. Restoring stability. Moving past the distracting narrative. This is the language of politics, not science. The goal was not to find the true age of the crater. The goal was to find an age that would make the problem go away. The meta-commentary here is on the power of framing. By immediately and successfully framing the Hiawatha discovery as a dating problem, the establishment performed a brilliant act of intellectual judo. They took the public's focus off the staggering, visceral coincidence of a mass extinction, a global platinum spike, and the discovery of a giant crater, and redirected it onto a technical, boring, and ultimately irresolvable argument about ice layers and sand grains. The long-term consequence is that a manufactured uncertainty has been allowed to neutralize one of the most important geological discoveries of the 21st century. The crater's true age remains a fiercely debated open question, but the public has been sold the fiction that the matter is settled. But what if this event, whether from Hiawatha or another source, wasn't a random one-in-a-million shot? What if it was part of a predictable, recurring, and far more terrifying pattern? The discovery of a potential smoking gun in Greenland, buried under a glacier, only deepened the most terrifying question of all. Was this a random event? A single unlucky strike from the cosmic void? Or was it something worse? Was it a clue to a larger, more coherent and potentially recurring threat? For decades, a small group of astronomers, most notably Victor Klube and Bill Napier, have been warning of exactly that. Their theory, known as coherent catastrophism, posits that our solar system is a much more dangerous place than we are led to believe. The source of this danger, they argue, is the ongoing disintegration of a truly colossal comet that entered the inner solar system some 20,000 to 30,000 years ago. This progenitor comet, perhaps 100 kilometers across or more, has been breaking up ever since, leaving a vast, broad, and complex river of debris in its wake. We know this river of debris. We fly through it twice every year. It is called the Taurid meteor stream. To most of us, the Taurids are a minor, pleasant meteor shower in late October. But what we see as a few shooting stars is merely the fine dust of the stream. Lurking within that same orbital path, Klube and Napier argue, is the rest of the comet's corpse. Larger, darker, and far more dangerous objects. This Taurid complex includes the comet Encke, believed to be the largest remaining fragment of the nucleus, numerous asteroids, and potentially vast unseen swarms of house-sized to kilometer-sized bodies, all traveling together in a correlated orbit. The hypothesis is as elegant as it is terrifying. The Younger Dryas impact was not a random strike from a rogue asteroid. It was an encounter with a particularly dense filament of debris from the Taurid stream. The Earth, in its annual journey around the Sun 12,800 years ago, happened to intersect with a cluster of large fragments from this disintegrating supercomet. The resulting bombardment, a series of airbursts and impacts across the globe, caused the Younger Dryas. The implication of this theory is profound. It transforms the Younger Dryas event from an accident into a symptom. It was not a singular event. It was a particularly violent episode in an ongoing cyclical process. The gun that was fired 12,800 years ago has not been removed from the crime scene. We are still flying through its line of fire year after year. While the chances of hitting another major debris swarm in any given year may be low, they are not zero. The threat is not gone. It is merely dormant. This recasts the entire debate from one of historical geology into one of modern-day risk assessment. The scandal here is the profound and inexplicable disconnect between the disciplines. The astronomical community has been developing the Taurid model for half a century. The geological and archaeological community has been struggling with the evidence for a Younger Dryas catastrophe for decades. Yet the two conversations have remained almost entirely separate. The geologists, for the most part, have systematically ignored the astronomical context that provides a perfect theoretical framework for their data. Acknowledging a cyclical threat is an order of magnitude more disruptive than acknowledging a random one. A random impact is a freak accident. A cyclical one is a chronic pre-existing condition that demands a permanent and expensive cure. This is a truth so uncomfortable that even the agencies tasked with protecting us from cosmic threats are reluctant to discuss it in public. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized internal risk assessment memo at a planetary defense agency regarding public communication strategy. The current public-facing threat model focused on the detection and mitigation of single large near-Earth asteroids, NEAs, is well established and publicly understood. Introducing the complexities of the Taurid stream hypothesis and the associated debris swarm encounter risk would be counterproductive. The threat is probabilistic, difficult to quantify, and lacks a clear, actionable mitigation path at present. Publicizing this could lead to misinterpretation and undue alarm, potentially eroding public confidence in our ability to manage the more tractable NEA threat. We recommend classifying the full Taurid risk assessment and maintaining the current communications focus on singular predictable impactors. Undue alarm. Tractable threats. This is the paternalistic language of information management. The long-term consequence of these academic silos and this institutional reticence is a catastrophic failure of imagination. The astronomers have identified a loaded gun. The geologists have identified a bullet hole in the wall of history. Yet the scientific community as a whole has refused to connect the two, to admit that the gun is still pointing in our direction. They are in different departments, they go to different conferences, they read different journals, and so the big picture, the terrifyingly coherent picture of our true cosmic environment remains undrawn. This failure to connect the dots leaves us in a state of profound and ultimately unjustifiable ignorance about the true nature of the sky above our heads, and it has left the scientific community itself in a state of irreparable division and civil war. And so, after decades of open warfare, of buried evidence and public ridicule, of bombshell discoveries and desperate counterattacks, where does this leave us? The simple, unsettling answer is that it leaves us in the middle of a fractured and irreparably divided scientific world. The war is not over. There has been no armistice, no surrender. The result is a Cold War, a bitter stalemate that has left the field of prehistory a polarized and toxic landscape. The old consensus is dead. The gradualist, terrestrial, Clovis-first narrative that ruled for a century has been shattered by the sheer weight of contradictory evidence. It was a beautiful, comforting story, and it has bled out on the floor of the laboratory. But in its place, no new consensus has been allowed to form. The establishment, the old guard, has been too powerful, too institutionally entrenched to allow that to happen. On one side, you have the impact proponents and a growing cohort of independent researchers. They have a coherent, unified theory supported by a multi-proxy, global database, nanodiamonds, microspherules, melt glass, a global platinum anomaly, a massive candidate crater in a perfect location, and a plausible astronomical mechanism in the torrid meteor stream. Their theory and theirs alone can explain all the major mysteries of the Younger Dryas boundary: the sudden cooling, the mass extinction, the wildfires, and the cultural collapse. On the other side stands the remnant of the old orthodoxy. Their position is now almost entirely defensive. Their grand counter-narrative, the meltwater pulse theory, is a scientific zombie, no longer credible as a global explanation. They are left with no unifying theory of their own. Their strategy has devolved into a kind of intellectual guerrilla warfare, attacking every single piece of impact evidence in isolation, arguing over methodology, promoting any study, no matter how flawed, that casts doubt on the impact timeline. Their power no longer derives from the strength of their ideas, but from their lingering institutional control over the top journals, the tenure committees, and the major funding bodies. This has left the public in an impossible position. When you look to the experts for answers about our own past, you do not find a consensus. You find a shouting match. You find two parallel, mutually exclusive realities. The result is a profound breakdown of scientific authority. The truth of what happened 12,800 years ago has become a matter of belief, of which tribe of scientists you find more trustworthy, of which narrative you find more compelling. This outcome, this state of perpetual unresolved controversy, is not an accident. It is, I would argue, the establishment's final, most cynical strategy. When it became clear that they could no longer completely suppress the impact hypothesis, they shifted to Plan B. Ensure that the debate remains a controversy forever. A state of permanent civil war is the next best thing to a victory for the old guard. It prevents the impact theory from ever being officially enthroned as the new consensus. It allows them to continue to refer to it as controversial or debated, thus containing its spread into textbooks and official curricula. It is a strategy of manufactured uncertainty. Uncomfortable. Quote, from a fictionalized but representative conversation between a university provost and the head of their earth sciences department discussing hiring and departmental policy. Frankly, I don't care who is right about this comet business. What I care about is that this department doesn't end up on the losing side of a very public, very ugly fight. The old guard still controls the NSF purse strings, but the impact theory is getting all the media attention. Here's what we do. We remain officially skeptical. Our departmental literature emphasizes the ongoing debate. You can let your junior faculty dabble in it. It makes us look open-minded. But you make damn sure our senior tenured people don't go on the record fully endorsing it. We play both sides. We survive. This isn't about finding the truth, it's about navigating the politics until the dust settles. This is the sound of truth dying by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. The meta-commentary here is on the very nature of scientific revolution. We have this idea from Thomas Kuhn that science proceeds through clean paradigm shifts, where a new theory decisively replaces an old one. The Younger Dryas controversy suggests a far messier, more political reality. Sometimes, a revolution doesn't succeed. It stalls, resulting not in a new kingdom but in a protracted, dirty civil war that ends in a permanent schism. There is no longer one unified science in this field. There are two warring sciences, each with their own facts, their own journals, and their own disciples. The long-term consequence of this is a deep epistemological wound. It tells the public that there is no such thing as objective truth, only competing narratives. It erodes our faith in the ability of science to answer our biggest questions. And it leaves us, the public, adrift in a terrifying sea of uncertainty about the true, violent nature of our own past, and the lie that we are still living with today. So we arrive at the end, in the rubble of a fractured consensus and a bitter, unresolved war. And we must ask the final, most important question. What was this really all about? The nanodiamonds, the platinum spikes, the ice cores, the crater buried under a glacier. These were the battlefields, the contested hills and trenches of this long and ugly war. But they were never the reason for the war itself. The true casus belli, the one great heresy that had to be suppressed at all costs, was never a piece of data. It was an idea. The Younger Dryas controversy was never just about a comet. It was about our civilization's desperate pathological refusal to accept a history far more violent and unpredictable than we were ever taught. The lie we still live with, the lie that this entire multi-decade campaign of suppression was designed to protect, is the foundational myth of the modern world. The lie of gradualism. It is the comforting bedtime story that progress is inevitable, that history is a long, slow, upward march, that the systems we have built are permanent, and that the ground beneath our feet is solid. It is the belief that the world is a safe and predictable place and that we are its masters. The Younger Dryas Impact hypothesis is the single most terrifying piece of evidence against that belief. It is a ghost from our recent past that whispers a chilling and unwelcome truth. We are a species with amnesia, living on a fragile planet that is subject to periodic, civilization-ending violence from the cosmos. It tells us that our entire global civilization, all of our art, our science, our history, is not a mighty fortress built upon the bedrock of time, but a delicate sandcastle built in the interlude between devastating storms. It tells us that everything we have built could be wiped away in an afternoon, and that it has happened before. This is the truth that cannot be tolerated. It is a truth so profound in its implications that the entire edifice of our scientific, political, and economic establishment was marshaled to deny it, to ridicule it, to bury it under a mountain of jargon and doubt and character assassination. They were not just defending a scientific theory. They were defending the very psychological basis of our calm, ordered, and productive modern lives. In the end, the story of this controversy is the story of humanity's encounter with an intolerable truth, and our almost infinite capacity for self-deception in the face of it. Uncomfortable. Quote, from the fictionalized memoirs of a retired historian of science reflecting on the Younger Dryas debate, I watched the Younger Dryas controversy unfold for 30 years. In my youth, I believed science was a pure search for truth. I now see it as something far more human. It is, in large part, a search for comforting, functional narratives. The gradualist paradigm is a deeply comforting narrative. The impact paradigm is not. The data was almost secondary. What I witnessed was a powerful, intelligent, and sophisticated society deploying all of its intellectual resources, not to solve a mystery, but to protect itself from the psychological trauma of the answer. We are not a species that seeks truth. We are a species that seeks reassurance. And the truth of our cosmic situation is not reassuring. We seek reassurance, not truth. That is the ultimate meta-commentary on this entire affair. The long-term consequence of this self-imposed blindness is a state of profound and dangerous fragility. By refusing to honestly confront the violence of our recent past, we have left ourselves psychologically and practically unprepared for the future. We continue to spend our fortunes on weapons to fight each other. We continue to build our economic models on the assumption of a stable and predictable future. And we continue to teach our children the comforting lie that our world is safe. We are navigating a dark and dangerous cosmic ocean, littered with the wreckage of past cataclysms, all while insisting, with the full force of our institutional authority, that there are no monsters in the deep. The battle for the Younger Dryas is far from over. The evidence for a cosmic catastrophe continues to mount, while the guardians of the old paradigm continue their desperate, rearguard action. What we are left with is not a conclusion, but a deeply unsettling question mark hanging over the entire story of human civilization. The cost of this secrecy, this multi-decade campaign to manage and suppress an inconvenient truth, is a profound ignorance about our own past and a dangerous complacency about our future. The story you have heard is a synthesis, a narrative built from the work of dozens of fiercely independent and often ridiculed researchers. The academic feuds are real, the evidence is real, the scientific papers are real. The uncomfortable quotes are fictionalized, but they are designed to reveal a deeper, documented truth about the politics, biases, and pressures that have shaped this incredible story. The official narrative is almost never the complete one, and in this case it may be the biggest lie of all. What do you think? Have you seen evidence in your own research that supports or contradicts this story? Share your thoughts, your data, and your questions in the comments below. And that's the truth they tried to bury. Until next time, always question the official story.